Okay, quick overview then of the Korean War. If we go back to the start, we need to remember that this is a proxy war, part of a bigger picture of the Cold War. So the Cold War starts, it says that, because the USA and the USSR have different ideologies. The USSR are communist, the USA are capitalist, and they're fighting about who's going to sort of lead the world. So who will lead the world? They had been working together during World War II, both against Germany and Japan. Japan is in Korea, remember, because they had colonized it. So because they had taken it over. Definitely from about 1910 onwards. So a little bit more about the Cold War. Again, it's about capitalism v communism, about who rules the world. And we have a public race and a space race, which the USA end up winning, but the USSR start to win. So the USSR make the first wins, but the USA wins with Man on the Moon. Man on the Moon. And the arms race. Both of these things are very expensive. Which damages sort of investment back home. And the arms race leads us to MAD, mutually assured destruction, the possibility that we've got so many nuclear bombs that if someone starts it off, the world could explode. The other thing we need to know before looking at Korean depth is this idea of fear of the communists. So we looked at the Red Scare of McCarthy in the 1950s in particular, but that had built on. So when Russia became communist in like the 1910s during World War One, there was lots of communist, like the first Red Scare was in the USA. There was lots of communist arrests. People thought they were trying to take over. There was a few bombs. So these fear of communism had sort of been for a couple of a generational type thing. And it was quite some of it was real. There were Russian spies over there, particularly when they were fighting over the nuclear weapons information. But it was also escalated for people's private gain. So it was the Red Scare. It was a fear of communism. Like within the population. So this fear, this competition is going to lead to the policy of containment and rollback. So the Truman Doctrine, remember, he was the president, and the doctrine was to contain communism, and he was going to do that under the Marshall Plan of giving money and basically advice or equipment to stop countries from that were vulnerable of turning communists from going to communist, to help support the governments that weren't communist in keeping the communists out. And we see this is the main reason why he ends up, or the USA ends up going into Korea. So if we have, go back up to the top. So at the end of World War II, we know the Japanese are in Korea, and the USSR, who are up here, are going to go in to kick them out of Korea and then launch their attack, get ready for attack on Japan. The Americans end the war quite quickly by bombing it. In part to end the war, and in part to show Stalin that they have got nuclear weapons and they are in charge. So then what we get is at the end of the war, they divide along a line on the map to the 38th parallel. So the USSR is in the north, the USA is in the south. They can organise this proper surrender and retreat of Japan from Korea, and deal with sort of like those sort of final peace talks. But also both sides are preventing the other one from taking it, because Stalin had wanted buffer states and had encroached on Europe and had just taken over countries that he'd freed from the Nazis. And the US did not like it because, remember, they're battling for the world. So Kim was a war hero. He was a communist. He'd worked quite closely with Mao's Communist China Army civil war, in their civil war, and he'd worked with Russian generals during World War II to try and get rid of the Japanese. So he was quite an expert in guerrilla warfare. He'd already built quite a big myth around him, and he was very popular at this time. In the south, we had Rhee, who had also been trying to fight for independence from Japan, but he had done it in exile in the USA, where he trained as a lawyer. So in 1948, when Kim got bored of waiting for the promised elections to reunite it, he takes power in the north, Rhee takes power in the south, and that is really becomes the permanent division of Korea, because remember, it's still divided today. Kim keeps asking for support because the Korean army is pretty much non-existent with weapons, because obviously they've been controlled by Japan. And during the fight with Japan, a lot of those have been gone. The light weaponry. Stalin kept saying no, the time wasn't right. There was US soldiers in the south who didn't want to risk nuclear, bringing America in, because they had nuclear weapons first, and he didn't. However, things change by 1949. So Mao isn't a king, but he becomes a leader. It's just a crown is an easier way of China, which means that the massive border that China and Russia share is now protected because it is communist. Stalin develops his own nuclear weapons in 1949, and the US troops finally leave Korea to go back home, sort of like end of 1949, early start of 1950. So on the 25th of June, 1950, Kim goes in with help equipment from Russia. He manages to very, very quickly push Rhee and the forces almost all the way out of Korea. They get stuck around this pocket area that we know as Pusan Pocket, mainly because of the geography. At this point, Truman goes to the UN and asks for intervention. Because the USSR is not there boycotting over the reaction towards Mao, because the UN and the US wouldn't recognise him, he was not able to stop the agreement to go in, because he was not there to use his power of veto. So on the 27th of June, the UN agree they're going to send in 16 countries. They land at Incheon in September, 15th of September, and they do a pincer movement where they push them all the way back up to the 38th. Then they're doing so well, they change their plan from containment to roll back, this idea of rolling communism out of Korea altogether. They push them all the way up. They get close to the Yangtze River. Mao gets concerned. He says, I'm feeling threatened. The UN sort of ignore that threat. And so he sends in 250,000 in October 1950. They overwhelm the UN forces, pushes them back beyond the 38th. Around this time, we end up having some fierce fighting. MacArthur suggests using nuclear weapons. He gets sacked because nobody wants it to escalate. And we end up with a stalemate around the 38th parallel where no one can get either side. This turns then into the war in the air, which is a mass bombing campaign mainly by the Americans. We have our secret Soviet planes with Soviet pilots dressed up as Chinese and not allowed to speak Russian, but had to speak Chinese on the radio. Worst kept secret ever, because the MiG-15s, remember, the US spent quite a lot of time trying to capture one. Lots and lots of bombs, more bombs in Korea than the whole of World War II, which is excessive, and including chemicals such as napalm. It goes on then from spring, spring 1951 all the way up till the end of the peace talks in July 1953. So at the time of this going on is some peace talks. They have a couple of things that they are arguing about. We have our prisoners of war, we have the border, and we have US troops going home. Keep stalling. They keep bombing. They try to hold land to move the border further up, and then they get pushed back, and they try to hold land there, and then it gets pushed back. And there's quite a lot of insults going on at the time. If you remember, the war doesn't end because of any decisive winning on the battlefield, but more because of the change in political circumstances. So if we jump to the other side, this is the political circumstances. So these are our political reasons, or international political reasons Korean War ended. So first thing was Stalin dies. Nope, that's not true. The first thing is Eisenhower replaced Truman in November 1952. So Eisenhower was a general. He was more concerned with what was going on in Vietnam, because Vietnam is one country next to quite a few countries that were vulnerable, I suppose, being very poor to communism. He had this domino theory that if one country in Southeast Asia became communist, then very quickly all the others would. So he is really wanting to invest and pay attention to Vietnam. Korea is a peninsula. It's sort of by itself. It's surrounded by communist powers anyhow. Japan was never going to go communist at this point, so he's sort of fed up. And then also Stalin dies in March 1953. So both Mao and Korea are not sure of the support. And then we could probably put Mao and his factories his 5-year plan on there as well. So Mao wants to spend more money at home and less money on a war. So then what happens is on the 27th of July 1951, they agree peace talks at that place, which I can never say. They create the border along the 38th, but they create the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. So it's 5 kilometers wide, and it's like a no-go area. Overall results then of the Korean War after all that time. Well, Korea is obviously the worst off. They've got 1 in 10 dead, so 10% of their population is dead. 80% of industry destroyed. The north is much more heavily bombed than the south. If you remember, one pilot on a bombing campaign was like, there is nothing left for me to bomb. China probably did the best, I would say, out of this. That's what I'm going to say. That's my opinion. One, because they've got close relationships with the USSR. It does get complicated later on, but they've got them as backup. They've come out, Mao's recognised as the leader. They've shown that they're a military power worth considering. And obviously, the industrialising of China starts to worry the capitalist world. The UN has also shown that it's going to act with NATO, that it is better than the League of Nations, but there's some controversy around whether it's just doing the US's bidding. And, everyone's sort of aware of the veto situation. The USA and the USSR probably both claim victory. Stalin's got his buffer state. The USA has kept the South as capitalist, so to stop the spread of communism in Korea. However, that's both cost them loads of money. The Korean War in 15 minutes.